Welcome to Become an Idol. I'm Dr. Robin Sargent, owner of Idol Courses. This is the place where newbies come to learn and veterans share their knowledge. I have here today with me Brian Harris, and Brian Harris is he's someone that's been in the Idol Courses Academy. He's an alumni, but he's more than that. He's a business owner. He's an e-learning designer and developer extraordinaire. And he just has so much wisdom and a great radio voice. So I can't wait to introduce you to Brian. Brian, will you please do a better job of introducing yourself and tell us your business name and all the background stuff?
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah. Brilliant Educational Services is the name of my business on brilliantelearning.com. And my background, primarily, I started doing learning experiences in the form of video. I did a lot of video learning experiences, a lot of content development in that regard. And when you do that, there's so many different talents and there's so many different jobs and so much different work associated with creating a video. So I just wound up doing a lot of that kind of thing. And I was working, I got laid off from a job and I went ahead and kind of started a new career, and instructional design came up to me. And it made a lot of sense in terms of the skill set that I already had and some of the passions that I had as well personally in terms of teaching, because I had taught before, learning, a focus on education. So those kinds of things really appealed to me. And then I could also utilize some of the design background that I had. So I started doing this instructional design, freelancing, maybe about 4 years, almost 3 years ago now, a bit more full time. And before that, maybe about 5 years doing some bits and pieces for some other professionals that I was just connected with personally, and gradually have turned it into my own kind of thing that I'm doing, my own company, my own one-man operation, with admittedly a great deal of thanks to the Idol Courses Academy, where I signed up. What year was that? That was 2020, I believe it was.
I think it was 2020. I think you were in one of our early, fourth cohort.
I think it was 4. Yep. So yeah, I signed up there, and it's been a really, really good experience for me in terms of not just learning and acquiring greater skill set, broadening my thought process and knowledge when it comes to learning itself, the study of learning, but then also how to design effective learning experiences, and then being incorporated into the community, the L&D community via Idol Courses Academy is really fantastic.
And now everyone knows who you are.
I don't know about that, but
well, you've been featured on Bell Vista Studios show, and I'm sure you've done other things as well. And I talk about you all the time because I just love that signature e-learning course that you made about counterfeit money in Peru. I reference it all the time. So,
oh, great! I'm glad you enjoy it. Yeah, it was one of those things. Counterfeit caper was just one of those things that it just kind of grew and grew and grew and grew and grew. And I kept working on it. And it was almost a reflection of kind of my own personality where, I got taken advantage of in Peru financially by somebody. And my reaction to it is, don't get angry, arm yourself with knowledge. And so that kind of motivation really led to a project idea and a concept, and it just kept going. And I was really, really glad to be affiliated at that time with the Idol Courses Academy to really have that motivation to not only design it, but then also, understand, hey, this is how you're going to make these types of things effective and engaging and, efficient. So I think that was really, really beneficial. And it's kind of grown into something that I didn't anticipate, but I'm glad it's been enjoyable.
I just love it. That's like the whole thing. I think a lot of what we do is half art, and art is like magic making in the sense that, you as the artist have, put in your creative thoughts and passions and knowledge right there in that one single e-learning course. But it's all these people that have observed it that have also felt something from it. And to me, that's pretty magical.
Yeah.
And that's why absolutely I think what's happened to the counterfeit caper. So now you have been in business, so probably 2, 3 full years now.
Yeah. It's been about 3 years now. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so I want to hear a little bit about your freelance business journey, just give a little more background. And then I think we want to talk about that process of meeting with clients and designing e-learning and how do we have conversations and how do we do better? There's a lot of talk around the word order taker. And I think we want to kind of reframe maybe what that means and what that conversation could look like and how we can do better. But just tell us a little bit about your business and the kinds of projects you've been working on.
Yeah. So the freelance business, I again, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I really do give a lot of credit to IDLE, the Course Academy. As you know, I signed up for the Freelancer Bootcamp first. That was the first one I did. And going through that was super duper eye-opening when it came to operating a business on your own, some of the concepts. And it's funny because I went through that and I was like, okay, I got it. But as you know, running your own business, you never really have it. You're always kind of learning, doing new things, getting new ideas, seeing how other people do things. And then I go back to the Freelancer Bootcamp and I was like, oh man, yeah, Dr. Robin and Christy and Dr. Nicole said that, 3 years ago, 2 years ago when I was taking this thing and I didn't listen to it then. And so now it makes sense to me. But I think it's been one of those things where the suggestions in there, as well as some of my own personal experiences, have just led me to keep working on it, keep making an effort, keep being consistent with the business that I'm trying to operate. And it's the IDLE Course Academy as well has led to other experiences and opportunities that I've had. But my business right now is I hope growing and continuing to grow when in regards to some of the customers that I work with. An idea of some of the types of work that I do a lot, admittedly, of e-learning, storyline based e-learning. And that is, I do a lot of training for teachers. I've got a couple of clients that I do training for teachers for kind of more compliance-based style of training. But I've had an opportunity to do some really cool stuff and work with some really, really talented and fun people in that space. And it's something that I never would have heard of, but it's really, really intriguing. And then in addition to that, I've recently been working with making job aids, handouts, marketing materials. I do voiceovers as well at times. So, and then we've done animations. I did a whiteboard style, explainer style animation. So again, kind of back to my roots in video, doing music, sound effects, sound design, animation, all those kinds of things, in addition to narration. So it winds up being a lot. But one thing I find myself doing a lot, and I didn't realize this when I get started, I do a ton of writing. I just never really understood or appreciated how much writing is involved in generating these ideas that go into design or go into e-learning development. So I do quite a bit of that for myself on my blog and just trying to continue to improve my craft as an instructional designer, as an e-learning developer, but also as a graphic designer, to a certain degree, a sound artist, a vocal artist, and then simultaneously try to, I guess, continue to make better learning experiences for the learner, whatever those may be, and get myself out of the mode of saying, hey, it has to be video, for example, or it has to be e-learning, but really get into the mode of what is the real issue at heart and what are the learners struggling with? Why is it that they're not doing this or complying with this? And what is it about them that we could leverage? What do we know about the learners that we can leverage to then make the experience more meaningful, more memorable, more engaging, and have better outcomes for them? So I'm always working on that at the same time, trying to build the business and get out there a little bit more as well.
So you've been building a lot. You've been working with several different types of clients on several different types of projects. And I guess that's kind of what brought us to what the conversation is today, which is What does that process look like to have a conversation with a client, whether that client is, well, in your case, it's a, freelance client, but in most people's cases, it'll be, the client is their organization that they work for full time. But I think that the tips and advice that we're going to talk about would apply to both situations. But so now you're starting to think about, okay, how can I create better learning? What can we leverage? So how has this process changed for you over time, working with clients and working through the process and having better conversations so that you can meet those outcomes?
Yeah, that's a great question, because for me, naturally, I'm a bit more of a doer. Like, I am very action oriented. So if someone says, do this, my inclination is, all right, let me figure out how to do it. Like, what do I need to do to be able to do that? And I get sometimes a bit myopic in doing something. But I think what's happened for me is a bit more of the why. Why are we doing this? What are we trying to accomplish? Who are we doing it for? Right. And then what can we do? And not in an effort to avoid work, but what can we do to make the solution the simplest and most effective that it can be? And I think the thing that's changed for me to a great degree is, I guess, less of an assumption that the person who's telling me what to do actually knows what needs to be done and really understands the thing fully. Because I think in conversations that I've had with people, they're coming into it maybe with some direction that they've got, and I think it's really, really good to try to understand. And that's one thing that I've done even with my business is when I talk to clients, I make every effort to understand kind of what is at the core of what they want to do. And that involves, at least from my perspective, it involves patience. It involves trying to have multiple conversations. It does involve, to a degree, a bit of disagreement. And by disagreement, I don't mean, angst, but I do mean, asking why, okay, why do you feel that this is the best solution? Why do you feel that this is what they need? And with it's a balance, isn't it? Because you can ask a question in a way that makes someone appear that you're doubting them or that you don't trust them or don't believe them. And I've certainly done that, not intentionally, but that's just kind of how I come across sometimes. But also really trying to ask a question in a way that helps you gives them the impression that you really want to understand more. And I think that's what I'm trying to get better at, is really understand more and then explain to people, why I'm asking this question. And hey, sometimes it goes well and sometimes it doesn't. Admittedly, I've had conversations with clients. It's like, hey, we don't need to ask that. And you'll say, okay, that's fine. But that doesn't necessarily mean I'm not going to ask any more questions or I'm going to stop trying. I do think where I've changed is I've really become more oriented on asking questions, but also a little bit more crafty on when to push, when to give, when to take, when to pull. I think it's a negotiation, and those negotiations are kind of delicate dances where we're both kind of moving together with a similar goal in mind, right? They want something. I, of course, in many cases, want to work with them. So it's kind of a balance to strike. And I'm just continuing to work on that balance. And as I understand learning, as I understand learners, as I, hear different perspectives on learners, it helps me to kind of craft in my mind what I want those kind of conversations with clients and stakeholders to look like. What kind of things do I need to ask for? And it helps me to prepare in advance in a way that I can ask and hopefully have a good conversation and build trust and build a good relationship.
I just feel like right now, Brian, I'm thinking like, well, but what does that look like? Do you have any kind of examples of a conversation that you can share with us where you've, maybe approached it in these new ways that you're thinking about, this delicate dance? Like, what does it What does it sound like?
Yeah. So I had a client who spoke to me about doing some e-learning, and they want e-learning. They had an ILT, right? They had an ILT. They say, okay, we're going to convert it to e-learning. And, I think sometimes online and on the internet and a lot of these people who I genuinely respect and whose viewpoint I really, really feel is legitimate in many areas. Sometimes people will say, well, hey, you know what? That's not something you want to do, push back immediately. But for me, I said to myself, well, if I'm the other person, I also think empathy is really important. If I'm the other person and I'm coming to a client and I say, hey, or coming to a subcontractor, someone who I want to hire, and I say, hey, I want to do this thing. And the first words out of their mouth is, no, absolutely not. We shouldn't do this. If that's the first thing I get to, I say to myself, how does this person know? Now I start to become suspect of their suggestion because they don't really understand me. So with that kind of empathetic approach in mind, I spoke to the client and my first thing was, that sounds great. We want to do X e-learning. We want to put all this training we had into e-learning. That sounds great. Let's do that. Tell me about the training. What is it that the training was on? What did you talk about? How long? I feel like I was asking some questions about the actual training just to kind of get the person talking about something that they're interested in, because this was not a C-level person. This was an L&D person. So from my perspective, with the client that I had, we're on the same level. We have the same goals, right? Is to make good quality learning experiences for the people that we serve. And so for me, I tried to then, once I understood kind of the project, what happened, the training, I tried to shift it a little bit to aspects of the training. Okay, who are the learners, right? Tell me who the learners are. Maybe you can help me to understand why this training you felt was necessary for them. And that opened up a big conversation, a great conversation with the person. And they started talking about, well, it's this level kind of leadership. And we have these motivations with this group, and we have that motivation with the other group. These people want to do it, that people don't. I said, okay, so now we're getting into learner motivation, which is great, right? Because that's the kind of thing that we want to talk about. That was the first conversation I had with the client was just a 20-minute conversation, just touch on a few topics. Okay, let's move on to a follow-up, right? So the follow-up was scheduled. We did it for an hour, and I repeated what the client had said the first time, just to make sure, hey, I'm trying to understand this. Do I understand this correctly? Yes, this is it. This is the thing. So then I tried a question. How are you looking for learners to change after they do this training? Like when you look at learners, how can you tell that someone has taken this training and another person has not, in terms of your company? And that led to another conversation, right? Why did the learners, because I had already opened up the conversation about learners. So I had already laid the groundwork for who the learners are. So I'm trying to ask him, why would they want to do this training? Like what's motivating for them to do it? Where are they at? Where are the learners at right now? Those kinds of things. I think for me, laying a groundwork, understanding what the problem is that they're hoping to fix, right? I think you just gradually work your way into those deeper conversations. And it's my opinion that people, the clients, the persons you're talking to, they'll either give you that information or they won't, so they'll give you an in to say, this. And so you can expand on something that they've already said rather than necessarily trying to bring up something new. So I think it's almost one of those things like building blocks, right? You at first lay a foundation for what they want, and then you start to show greater curiosity for some of the things that they've said and try and understand those better. That leads to other things, and that leads to other things. Of course, I don't just, have a conversation where we're kind of bouncing around with people. I have an outline in front of me, on my computer screen with things that I've thought of prior to the conversation. I have questions that I send to those who inquire about the services. So then I get some information about their project before we even meet. So based on that, I kind of give myself an outline of what kinds of things I might ask about. And then I let the conversation just kind of go and see what happens.
I love how you even worded the question, Brian, where you said, what is the change that you want to see? How will you know if one person has taken the training and the other person hasn't? Because there's so many other ways I think we usually ask those questions that are probably wrapped up in our own jargon and our own understanding of what those things mean.
Yeah.
But the fact that you just say, like, what's the change that you want to see?
Yeah.
I mean, and so at the very beginning, it's if you can just, lead them in a friendly conversation, you find that you get most of what you need right there in that beginning conversation.
Yeah. So, I mean, I would say my first scoping kind of call with the person, I set that up on my website. If you say you click on my let's talk, let's get started, it's a 20-minute conversation. And I feel that in 20 minutes, you can get a feel for what to ask next. That's my opinion. And it obviously is going to vary based on the size of the project, right? So, sometimes in 20 minutes that works, sometimes it doesn't. But I think, I can get a feel for how much we can talk about, how far we can go in that first conversation, depending on who I'm talking to. And, it's a matter of, when you're freelancing, in many cases, it's a matter of, hey, do I want to do this with this client or not? In some cases, you're desperate. And if you are, then that's fine too. I feel like there's no sin in taking a not so ideal client if that's what you need, and that's fine. But I think that sometimes we just have to try, and we have to continue to make the effort to go kind of push things into what might be considered the more ideal direction. But it doesn't always end up that way. Like even with this client, I told him at the end of our conversation, at the end of our second conversation, that, hey, what we're going to do is we're going to take what you have and convert it. That's the base. We're going to take what you have and convert it. However, as we go through the process, there may be opportunities where I can make a suggestion and see what you think about adjusting the learning experience to help you to accomplish the change that you want to see, to help you to bring the motivation of certain learners up, right? To make sure that based on the environment that they're in, they're going to have a better experience. Because I think an important aspect of learning experience design, especially in dealing with clients, is making the effort to add value to the experience for the learner as well as for the client in accomplishing real measurable goals. And sometimes people want that and sometimes they don't, but it is what it is. It doesn't negate the value of the effort. So I think, yes, to your question, I would say, yes, I can get a lot out of that first conversation and a lot out of a second conversation. And I'm always inclined to talk more, if we can, depending on what the time frame of the project is, to get better understanding, to see if I can continue to position myself as more of a advocate for the project rather than the project executor, and it's a balance to strike. And we just, in my opinion, just keep trying to go in the right direction. It's not going to be perfect every time, but keep working with the clients to make sure it's heading towards where you would hope it would be.
I have pulled out so many golden nuggets from this, Brian. First was, what's the change that you want to see, and like leading them through a conversation where basically you're just asking them to talk about what they already know, what they're already interested in. You're just kind of leading them. And then I love how you basically have set expectations. You say, yes, I'm going to give you what you want, and I will make suggestions to help you reach these goals, these changes that you said that you wanted. So right there at the beginning, it's like you've already set yourself up with them, right? By saying like, I'm going to make suggestions to make some changes, to make some improvements based on what you said that you want. And so I can already see how just setting just these couple of tips would set you up for a better place to where you're not combating them, but you are not an order taker, but instead you truly are paving a path to be a partner, which is what we want, but we don't want to come off as, like you said, like our first conversation is like, oh, I don't do that type of grunt work.
Yeah. Yeah, no, exactly. I think, I mean, it would be a similar thing if you hired someone to do your landscaping and you say, hey, can you mow this lawn and do like, I don't do mowing lawns. That's ridiculous. I'm a landscaper. I'm going to talk about changing your lawn. You're like, well, that's not really what I wanted. Right. But we can get to that point where you can have landscaping suggestions. But at first, let's talk about mowing the lawn. So I think sometimes it is valuable in having a basic conversation with someone about what they want first and allow the relationship to develop to the point where, you can get, maybe you don't have time for that. That's fine too. Move on. But, if you can do it, I think there's value in that, because rather than creating a client that bounces from one person to the next and says, well, this person pushed back on me and that person pushed back on me and that person pushed back on me. I think you can paint people into a corner a little bit where they're going to be less inclined to listen to the next person. But or you can be a someone who does what they want, but also advocates for things that are better. And then maybe the next time, even if it's not with you, maybe the next time, I mean, obviously, ideally it is with you, right? They continue to come back. But if the next time, maybe they may be more open from the beginning to hear what a learning professional has to say about the topic, about the e-learning, about the learning experience, and it gets a better learning experience next time. And I think that's an aspect of what we all want to try and do, is continue to move the industry in the right direction. And it can't necessarily be from only being in, fighting ourselves into the stakeholder position. You have to work your way up there, and it takes time and effort. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But I think it's an effort well worth it, in my opinion.
What have been your strategies for, okay, you've laid the groundwork, right? You've set their expectations. You know what the motivations of their learners are. You know what represents change for them. And so you've done a great job setting it up. But when you actually make the suggestions, what is that? How do you have those conversations? Do you ever get, when you do, let's just pretend that you do.
Yeah.
Let's say that you do get pushback when you're making the suggestions, even though you've set up those expectations. How do you handle it from there? I mean, obviously it's a lot easier since you set expectations, but what does that kind of look like? Because I think that's usually where people get stuck too, is like, okay, maybe I've set the groundwork, but now I'm actually making the suggestion and they're like, no, this is the way we want it.
Right. Again, I hate to, at the expense of sounding like a broken record, it is a bit of a balance. I've made so many videos in the past, and I've worked with so many different individuals as stakeholders. And I tell you, I've been shut down on ideas 6 ways to Sunday. I really have been. I've had ideas about all sorts of things, and I've just been burned down on several occasions. But I think when it comes to making the suggestion, one aspect of it is making a good prototype. And I can't remember who said this. It might have been Kathy Moore or in one of her books, but like really making a good prototype that shows them exactly the thing that they want, right? Because I think where I've made mistakes in the past is not even doing the thing that the client wants. Like, this is a bad idea, so I'm not even going to do it. I'm going to do this other thing, and then kind of present this other thing as, hey, this is a superior idea. But empathy has helped me to really kind of understand the thing from their perspective. And that is, hey, we had this idea and you might not know what went into it, right, to getting it to that point. But we wanted to see this thing brought to fruition first. Right. And then maybe from there, it becomes obvious that something needs to change. So my thought on it is, depending on, of course, what the situation or the circumstance is, you can come up with a new idea or a new proposition, a new concept to present. But to a certain degree, there does need to be a presentation of what was agreed upon first. And and then have a conversation about it, depending on how well it's working. And to me, if you have the bandwidth or the ability to also present an alternative, so that way at least the person can, the stakeholder, the client, whoever, can A/B the option, then that's good. I think that's better. You don't necessarily have to make a career out of the alternate, right? But it should be something that is viable, such that someone can look at it and say, make a legitimate comparison between the two, where the alternate or the original is not distracting, right? Sometimes people, I've seen this done before, right? In design, you'll have, hey, this is what you wanted, and this is what I think it should be. And the one that you think it should be is like so much nicer. And the one that they want is like kind of ratty. And you say, oh, okay, come on. Like that's manipulative. I think we definitely want to have the conversation based on two things that are like. We want to compare apples with apples. So, making something that's what they want, to say, hey, I made the effort on what you wanted. I made the effort on this. And as I was doing it, this idea came to my mind that it might be more effective. So one, it's not necessarily presenting just, hey, this is a new idea based on what you had, but based on what you wanted, here's an idea that might expand that, or might improve this for learners, might improve the learning experience. And then the other aspect of it is why. This is why. Be based on the context of where this fits in, based on what you said about the learners, based on what we know about what change we're trying to effectuate. Here's why this might be a better solution. And see how the person feels. Sometimes they're obviously going to be, no, we're in love with this thing that we got. That's fine. It really is what it is. If they're paying the bills, then that's what it is. But at the same time, I do think those things can gradually work and be beneficial. The proposition of changes can be beneficial without necessarily having to be acrimonious. And something that I've learned too is, and especially in dealing with some of the trainings that I've done with teachers, is at other times there are other things at play that you're just not aware of. And so your idea might in and of itself for a change, it might be valid, but in the context of other things that you don't know, those other things might be invalidated. And so you have to try to find those out. And sometimes there's no way you can know those things without making a suggestion. And then the person says, well, because of this, and this, we're not going to do that. You say, okay, that's fine. It might also be that they just don't like it and they don't want to do it. I've had that happen to me too. So it's like, I think, we do to a degree as learning professionals, and it's a challenge. There is a degree of cultivating kind of this indefatigable spirit where you're always doing your best to advocate for the learner, to advocate for making the experience as effective, engaging as possible, to advocate for making real change. And sometimes people don't want to do that, and that's okay. But that practice is still viable, still valuable for you as a professional.
Okay, I have one more question along these lines, and it popped in my mind, and that is, okay, there's a lot of takeaways I think that people have had from here about like guiding that conversation. Mm-hmm. What about at the beginning when you've had your conversation with them and, you know what the change is, you know who the learners are, you know mm-hmm. what they're asking, but your solution that is different from what they're asking, right, mm-hmm. would probably be more expensive.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's what I'd be curious about. Like, well, how do you have that what does that negotiation kind of look like for you when somebody comes to you with an idea mm-hmm. and they're like, oh, just make, click next eLearning or whatever. Mm-hmm. And you're like, but we could do better. How does that negotiation look like for you? Do you still try to work with them? And how?
That's a good question. I think, from the very beginning, especially in freelancing, and I think this is probably true of any freelance business or anything, probably any business. If we can't have a conversation from the beginning about money, then it's not really going to be workable or viable. I feel like there has to be, even before we kind of get into the solution part of things, there has to be an understanding of where the person is coming from with their budget. I've heard Christy Tucker in the eLearning Freelancer Bootcamp. She said that, she asks from the beginning, what kind of budget do you have in mind for this? Because, these kinds of e-learnings, they cost X $1,000, right? And so if you are not really, if you want a $5,000 e-learning for $500, then there really isn't much that we're going to be talking about in terms of solutions, because the kind of fundamental here is not enough. The foundation is not enough to build on to get to where I think this thing should go. And so that would negate that kind of conversation anyway. I feel like as the balance of learning professional and business person is the one to strike, right? Because you do need to talk about how much they've allocated or what in their minds they're thinking this thing should be budgeted or should cost. But also, I think there's a need to try to understand where they are from the perspective of what they want to do with the thing, right? What they want the thing to do. Do they really want this to be something special? For example, they say, man, I really want this thing to shine. It's really, really a really important project to us, the company, what have you. We think it should be this. So you say, okay, so now you've kind of got an idea of, well, if this thing is special and you really want it to be something special, then here's where we can go to make it that special thing. However, the dichotomy between where we should go and your budget needs to be addressed, right? And is that something from your perspective as a client? Do you feel like that's a place where you want to go and are willing to go? Or do you say to yourself, nah, we really got to cap it at this thing? I think it's not just one conversation in terms of the solution. It's two conversations in trying to get an understanding of where they are with their budget and their feel on the piece. And then are we going to go to another level with it? I had that a couple of years ago where we did an e-learning animation, and the client was like, hey, I'm thinking that it's going to be this X thousand. But as we got into the weeds on it and said, this is what you really want, it's actually going to be like double that. So now how far of that double are you willing to go? Because that gives us an idea of, well, the client really wanted the thing to be special, really wanted it to be impactful, and really, really thought it had, as a product, it had a real viability in the future for making big impacts. So they were willing to go the extra mile on the budget. Not everyone's like that, right? So how do you figure that out? I think you have to have those conversations and have them openly and candidly. I look at a lot the Future podcast with Chris Do, and on his podcast they talk a lot about just being candid with the money and having those conversations up front and knowing your worth and knowing the kinds of things. And I think, that kind of prep is important yourself to be there and to then make a decision. It's like, okay, if this person is not going to go that far with this, then here's what we can do with what you got, and you being the decision maker as to whether or not that's going to be something that you want to do or not, Oh,
that's an excellent answer. And you're right. I mean, I think that, a lot of people feel intimidated about talking about money and things like that. But really and truly, in this part of your business, you are the salesperson. And if they don't want to talk about money, that means they aren't showing any buying signs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah. So you definitely want somebody who's going to show buying signs before you even spend your time.
Right.
Setting up your conversation.
Right. Because it's time consuming, right? To sit down and think about, okay, what's the solution? What am I going to come up with? What are we going to do? That's time. And that's your money, right? That's you working. So if someone's not going to really, go there with you, then that's okay. In my opinion, obviously, if they're about to foreclose on your house and take your car away, you might have a different circumstances in which you make that decision, but it's fine.
Yeah. So here we are. I think that we've talked a lot about this. Is there anything else about reframing our conversations or being more of a partner that you wanted to mention, like any last and final tips?
Yeah. The one thing I would say, and this is something that was told to me, and I say it to everyone, don't give up. I think that's where we tend to lose out a little bit is, hey, I think this, and someone shuts you down, then it's like, well, I'm not going to say anything like that anymore to this person or anything like that anymore to anyone else. And we kind of over police ourselves in advocating for the project, advocating for the learner. And again, it doesn't mean you need to be this kind of brash, devil may care person who is always going to push back on everything. It's not necessary, but you can definitely continue to look for opportunities and chances to try and make the thing better, to try and have those conversations, to try and ask questions, to try and introduce ideas that may lead to something better, some improvement. And that's the one thing that I would probably say is I think we all need to not give up. We all need to keep trying. We all need to keep refining our efforts and using different strategies and getting better with empathy to try and understand that other person. Because, and Kim said this on the Bella Vista Studios, she was like, hey, I really lead with love. And I say, wow, that's really great, because an aspect of love is empathy, understanding that other person. And I think when we really try and do that and not just shut ourselves down, then we make the space for having the conversations that need to be had and making the positive changes that need to be made.
Boom. There it is. There. That was incredible, Brian. I think this will be really enlightening for so many who have heard different sides of this conversation, and just seeing that there is a middle way, there is a middle path.
Yeah.
And my last question from you, Brian, is I know you've mentioned the Chris Do podcast, The Future.
Yep.
Are there any other resources that you've just kind of turned to in being better at negotiating and empathy and moving this conversation forward with all your future projects? Any resources you want to give shout outs to?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, like I said, the Future podcast with Chris Do, I bounce back to him and his stuff on YouTube and things like that really a lot, because it's super duper helpful. And again, a broken record, but I found your eLearning, Freelancer eLearning Bootcamp, the sessions, the Wednesday sessions, to just be really, really great with you and Christy and Dr. Nicole, to just, again, hear it. I don't think you're necessarily saying a new thing in a new way, but to just hear the same thing over again, it's like, yeah, that's right. Okay. Yeah. That, it kind of reassures me and helps me to firm up a bit of a thought that I had already. Obviously, Christy Tucker's blog is great, and so is Dr. Nicole's, and so is the Idle Courses Academies. Those blogs are really, really great. And I also really like the 3-Star Learning Experiences blog. For me, getting better with understanding the science, the background, the theory of learning, and balancing that theory with pragmatism and the practical aspect of creating something, that has really, really helped me to say, hey, I want to advocate for this thing. I like Learning Science Weekly. I read Learning Science Weekly all the time. I think it's great. Obviously, the eLearning coach, Connie Malamed's website is fantastic. I don't have like a go-to. I read Aunt Pew, his emails. I get his emails every day, and I read, some of them I say, I'm not sure about that, but I really appreciate kind of his take and approach on things. It's a variety of sources that I use to kind of gain a bit of a balanced input or a balanced mentality for myself. And I mean, shoot, I don't have all the answers, for goodness sakes. And I really don't think anybody does, but I think we can all continue to keep growing and learning from one another and from our own experiences to try and get a little bit more confident to next time, every time we go take a step in the right direction next time, and just get better and ultimately make better learning experiences that really impact learners and effectuate real change.
Thank you so much, Brian. This has been an absolute pleasure. And I feel like I've learned a few things. And so thank you so much for coming and sharing with us on the Become an Idol podcast.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for listening. You can find the show notes for this episode at idlecourses.com. If you like this podcast and you want to become an instructional designer and online learning developer, join me in the Idle Courses Academy, where you'll learn to build all the assets you need to land your first instructional design job, early access to this podcast, tutorials for how to use the eLearning authoring tools, templates for everything course building, and paid instructional design experience opportunities. Go to idlecourses.com/academy and enroll or get on the waitlist. Now get out there and build transcendent courses.